I should start with a disclaimer. Bruce and Paul initially hoped to have Anna Rowland from the UK speaking at this session, but she was unavailable. And in some desperation, I met with Paul to talk about tennis, cycling, and Catholic social theory. And in desperation, Paul said, "Why don't you do it?" So here I am. I'm delighted. I'm delighted about the tennis and the cycling bit. I'm delighted to be here because it's great to be part of this conversation about the common good. But it's also been a good thing as a catalyst to read Anna Rowland's book, The Politics of Communion. It's a wonderful book, and I'm happy to say that my thinking resonates with hers, even though hers is a much greater level. Hopefully, as part of the ongoing journey, we can involve Anna Rowland in this conversation because she is a wonderful writer and a wonderful person. I want to start by saying that our discussion about the common good, we need to keep at the forefront of our minds the global polycrisis in which our world is located. As we're aware, well, we may be roughly aware, over the last half century, the world's technological development has proceeded at what Will Steffen called the Great Acceleration. Earth scientists now say that we live in a global technosphere, which encompasses our food production systems, our energy generation, manufacturing, health services, and of course the regulatory and financial environment within which those happen. Earth scientists call it a technosphere because its scale and its impact on the Earth system in which it's embedded is so great that there's been the deliberations, as you know, about whether or not we have entered a new geological era in which human activity has been so great that we have actually measured up to. We're transforming the ecosphere in which we're embedded. Of course, it's a boon for many people, including ourselves, because we live in this livable city with all the affluence it provides. And so, in a sense, we are beneficiaries of that. But at the same time, it's generated a massive polycrisis with several dimensions. The continuing expansion is such that it threatens the stability of human society, but life on Earth itself. And let me just briefly list what some of those are. First of all, there's continued technological expansion. Most obviously in terms of the developments of digital technology, artificial intelligence, and which there's much discussion at the moment, and for which many people say we're entering a new industrial revolution equal to the ones in the past. But for many others, these developments presage an increasing shift of economic inequality, of corporate control, and also the threat to human existence itself. But of course, amidst all the discussion about AI and so on, behind that lies the even greater threat of developments in nuclear weapons. As we know, last week was the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And that's brought to mind the fact that our current situation is more powerless than it's been for decades. Indeed, the doomsday clock is now set a minute and a half before midnight. And the geopolitical situation is such that the stability of the nuclear system, mutually assured deterrence, is being frayed as various countries develop weapon systems that can be used for tactical nuclear weapons and so on. So there is a major threat to our taken for granted cornucopia by technological developments themselves. But of course, the major threat to the Earth system lies in the ecological impact of ongoing technological development. We focus on climate change, but as Earth scientists remind us, there are several planetary boundaries which are being violated by the developments of human technology. It's not only in impacts on climate, but in terms of biodiversity. You may be aware that we are currently in the world, there is currently in Geneva a conference on the attempt to limit the production of plastics. It's unlikely to succeed because of the impact of corporate lobbying. But the scale of plastic production has been such that in 1950 there were 2 million tonnes of plastic being produced. By 2022, that was up to 475 million tonnes. And if the petroleum industry has its way, it will triple by 2050. And of course, as we know, plastics represents a major threat in terms of the novel entities that now pervade our whole system. And of course, that can be replicated in other areas as well in terms of the impact on our global ecological systems. And underlying that is the whole problem of neoliberal corporate capitalism. The shifts that have happened in our political economies and the regime of economic activity been such that markets and capitalist enterprise has been able to have a free rein in terms of exploitation of resources, resulting in social dislocation, also increased economic inequality, and also the loss of any kind of overarching sense of the common good. And of course, this is reflected in the fragmentation of our levels of global governance. We pride that we've been blessed by the fact we live in something like the liberal international order. But as we've seen in recent developments in America, in elsewhere, that is being frayed. And so that we are moving into a new world, an uncertain world of multipolar governance. And last but not least, at a deeper level, there's a sense of cultural malaise in which the whole notion of Western modernity has been brought into question. Pankaj Mishra, the Indian essayist, written a book called The Age of Anger, but also says bluntly, the Western model is broken. And so we live in times when, now of course, as I said before, we can sense this as a background, but in fact it impinges on our lives in all sorts of ways, and it's likely to do so in the coming time. So discussing about common good, we need to be mindful of that, even as we deal with common good issues at a more local and national level. On a positive level, there are many agencies working tirelessly in our world, trying to engage in the struggle to reshape the global technosphere in a way that can move towards more justice and sustainability and peace. Paul Hawken, in his book Blessed Unrest, talks about the sense there is a movement of social justice, environment and peace groups operating in the world, have been operating for a long time and continue to do so. And he reckons that this is a major kind of below the radar movement in our world, and we can give thanks for that. At any major conference that occurs, there are social justice groups that are lobbying, putting pressure, assembling, and we can see that. I mean, the best example of that to me in recent times was the students in Vanuatu who actually had a school project which they went to the United Nations and said, states have an obligation, a human rights obligation, to protect us from the ravages of climate change. The UN referred to the International Court of Justice, and just last couple of weeks, the ICJ found in their favour. Now, of course, that doesn't have any kind of obligation for states to adhere to it, but nonetheless, it's a major moral action that was initiated by a bunch of students in the South Pacific, and that can be seen across the world. Fridays for the Future is an example of movements that are happening. Paul Hawken, in his various scenarios, Paul Hawken works at the TELUS Institute in Boston and developed various scenarios of how the great transition to a more just and peaceful world might occur. And Hawken says that our best hope lies in the activities of the global citizens movement. He reckons that that governments and corporations, their efforts will be too little too late. It'll only be through the actions, the effective actions of citizens groups that will actually nudge the world towards making the transition. And he can point to a whole range, as I mentioned before, a whole range of NGOs and pressure groups, both in terms of, for example, Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, which operate at a high level, but also local groups in terms of defending wetlands and protecting forests and so on. And I guess next point is that these efforts, the effectiveness of these efforts and the possibility that Paul Hawken's scenario might actually come to pass depends upon a culture of citizenship, cultures of citizenships within the civil societies in which they're embedded. The fact that Greta Thunberg could have such an impact depend on the fact that there were people who responded to her sit-ins and then to her strikes on Fridays, and some of you may participate in the efforts a couple of years ago before the pandemic. So there are cultures of citizenship which exist in our societies upon which any kind of global citizens movement depends. These cultures themselves have depended upon the traditions of political liberalism, about which there's much debate at the moment. Liberal movements and ideas have been at the forefront of the recognition and protection of individual rights and freedoms of belief and association, inquiry and democratic participation, the limitation of political authorities, a robust public sphere, the rule of law. All of these ideas come out of a particular political tradition of liberalism, about which there is much discussion and which I think is at the centre of any kind of attempt to develop a robust account of the common good in our contemporary world. The core principles of individual autonomy and social equality, the notions of, if you like, liberty, equality and fraternity are integral to the liberal tradition. There is also, it's important to say, I think, that liberalism, despite its critics, also has some sense of the common good. There is a sense of social solidarity, the universal notion of human rights. We see this in, one example I like is the Sustainable Development Goals. No one left behind. There is a kind of wonderful moral notion that we're all in this world together. The Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, expresses in the context of environmental issues, that sense of the common good needs to be pursued. However, there are limits to liberalism, and one of the major and important critics of liberalism is Michael Sandel. Michael Sandel has criticised liberalism on various grounds. Its underlying notion of the unencumbered self, that liberals emphasise freedom from rather than freedom within. Sandel also criticised the notion of a proceduralism in public life and the neutralism, which means that the notions of shared values and solidarities can be obscured, and so the argument that the public sphere and the role of government is neutral with respect to comprehensive worldviews, to refer to John Rawls. Sandel says this is both obscures the reality and the necessity of a public philosophy, but also makes us more vulnerable to greater fracturing of public life. Sandel says we can't decide on any of the questions that we argue about without implicitly relying on certain ethical ideas, certain ideas of justice, certain ideas of common good. We can't be neutral on these questions, even if we pretend to be. So Sandel has been pushing for a recovery of the language and the notion that human life, human public life, human political life depends upon some shared sense of values. Now, the weakness and inarticulacy of mainstream liberalism has been greatly exacerbated by the neoliberal mutation or revolution, which has taken by storm since the 1980s. The notion that there is no kind of common census, the notion that we can rely on market relationships as the primary way in which we order social life. Margaret Thatcher's almost proverbial words, "There's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families," captures that sense that social life has involved individuals in competition in pursuit of their own individual goals. It's involved a reorientation of government. The role of government is to facilitate market processes. So privatisation, outsourcing, all those kind of effects were being introduced as a way of facilitating greater economic development. And the presumption was this will also lead to better social development. And although at one level, the notion that the orthodoxy of neoliberalism has been discredited, particularly since the global financial crisis, it's had a much deeper effect on the institutions and practices of government, business and civil society. As Wendy Brown puts it, we now live in the ruins of neoliberalism. We now have to deal with the problem of entrenched inequality, where tax breaks become the dominant sort of political orientation, the corporate capture of government, and also a kind of dominant techno-economic nihilism, that technology is being developed for economic development and corporate profit rather than necessarily for social good. And there's been an erosion of the notion of a social cohesion. And as one writer puts it, we now live in an age of fracture. Julianne Schultz, who writes The Guardian, made reference to the thing that the centre cannot hold, things fall apart, a reference to Yeats's famous poem. For me, the ruins of neoliberalism I captured for me in the notion of a metaphor of a timber house. The structure still stands, but the role of termites has actually eroded and destroyed its internal coherence and fabric. So the legacy of neoliberalism is something which any discussion about common good needs to address. And of course, we know that the effects of neoliberal reforms, the social and cultural effects, have given rise to overtly anti-liberal responses, right-wing populism, and also religious fundamentalism. So it's against this background, its context, there is the task to recover, to re-articulate, and to restore some kind of public philosophy, a post-liberal public philosophy of the common good that can nourish and defend the cultures of active citizenship and which can underpin a global citizens' movement. Meeting the challenge of developing this public philosophy also needs to recognise the role of religion. Whilst many liberal theorists, like Lilith, for example, says that the exclusion of religion from public life is part of the necessary conditions of public peace, there is a recognition that religion is necessarily, unavoidably going to be part of any kind of public conversation. And in his books, Secular Age and before that, Sources of Self, Charles Taylor has emphasised the importance of individual and social and political life doesn't necessarily involve a transcendent dimension that was particularly strong in his Sources of the Self. And in the Secular Age, his real insight was to say that our contemporary life in liberal society is framed within what he called the immanent frame, which of exclusive humanism, which says that we don't need to refer to anything else unless you particularly want to, unless you happen to be disposed to be religious. And Taylor points to the fact that the exclusion of transcendence from political life is a fundamental source of its incoherence and destabilisation. Louis Dupre says, once the source of meaning and value came to reside exclusively in the human subject, any possibility of reaching a consensus on the common good beyond that of creating an environment conducive to individual self-realisation becomes extremely difficult. I see no chance of regaining even a minimal agreement on what constitutes the common good without some return to a religious view, a moral view of human place in cosmos and society. And it's this growing awareness of the importance, the irreducible importance of transcendence, that has given rise to the re-emergence of several strands of post-secularist Christian political theology that have contributed to and take up the challenge of re-articulating the included underpinning of social and political life. Importantly, they go beyond the assumption that the role of Christians in politics is to bring ethical and theological insights to a pluralistic public sphere. Anna Roland quotes the German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper to say that this involves piercing the dome. Reading Pieper, she says, one comes away with the idea that the task of theology is not to produce technical solutions to modern problems, but the sharing and articulation of the collective struggle to know and to act under modern conditions. He insists that the task of theology is to pierce the dome, to access and speak of what is transcendent from within the framework of immanence. Sadly, in my view, the most visible strand of resurgent post-secular political theology is that of an assertive anti-liberal Christian authoritarianism, expressed in dominionism in the US and also Catholic integralism, emphasising the need to restore a Christian moral and hierarchical order over against the perceived chaos and fragmentation of a liberal secular polity. In my view, the more faithful Christian political theology is one that aims to recover the politics of Jesus. By that I mean the metaphysical and political meanings of the Christ event and of its ongoing outworking in human history. In terms of metaphysics, the Christ event entails a theopolitical vision that sees the alternative frame of an unfolding drama of a divinely instituted creation project, the ex nihilo coming into being of a creational order marked by its dynamic generative creativity, and in which human beings have been tasked with the vocation of being God's image bearers, enabling and shaping the realisation of creation's potential. Politically, the Christ event underpins a form of Christian association which is centred on the upside-down lordship of a crucified Messiah, which Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, says, whilst it seems absurd to the world, nonetheless, this is the core that the crucifixion of Jesus represented. and most famously expressed by John Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas, and also by radical Orthodox theologians. For them, their task is not for Christians to become involved in a domain of politics outside the church, but to recover the church's own intrinsic politics, the upside-down politics of the kingdom. And if we get time, I'd talk about some of the ways in which that comes through in the early church and thereafter. It's been a struggle. This politics is most centrally and focally represented in the Eucharistic worship of Christian assembly. It's the primary site where Christian believers express an identification with this drama. In the Eucharist, we celebrate the extraordinary creation and its sacramental vibrancy. We celebrate in our humble contrition. We open ourselves to the cleansing and renewing gift of God's Spirit, a gift that enables us to follow the way of Jesus in following our vocation. And we also affirm hope in the eschatological perfection of God's creation. As William Kavanagh, among many others, emphasised, Eucharistic worship isn't a kind of separate spiritual activity. He argues it's inherently political, and most dramatically in his book, Torture in the Eucharist, and a study of how the Catholic Church responded to the Pinochet regime in Chile, and pointing to the fact that part of Eucharistic worship is to be engaged, to be entangled with wider politics. Hauerwas, Yoder, Kavanagh and others emphasise the church as a distinct polis. However, it's a mistake to see it as separate from the world. Rather, it's a counter-politics, which is not separate from over against the world, but an ongoing dialectic with the practices, institutions and cultures of the world in which we live. It's a dialectic which expresses the notion of the already and the not yet of Christ's kingdom, in which the presence of the kingdom reframes the world as a secular space which Christian life can flourish. In this view, the secularity and openness of the liberal public sphere, as well as the common sense of common life involved in that, involves not the exclusion of religion as a contradictory dimension, but as Oliver O'Donovan has suggested, it expresses the underlying logic of the Christian secularity and the Christian secularity of the gospel story. O'Donovan, in fact, argues that the weakening of this dialectic, where the church has failed to maintain the openness that flows from the Christ's upside-down kingdom, and the exclusion of religion from public life, resulted not in peaceable flourishing, but in the distortions of political and cultural life that he terms a modernity of menace. At the heart of this, to bring this perhaps down to a more practical level, at the heart of this dialectic, I think, depends upon the existence of a culture of Christian citizenship within parish and community life. In other words, it's a bottom-up view of how the common good of a secular society, how Christians contribute to this larger common good. To recognise that as Christian believers who assemble week by week in parish life, that we are called to live out a dialectical relationship between the eschatological promise that comes from the Christ event and the turbulent flourishing of worldly life. What I'm suggesting is that the notion of citizenship amongst Christian communities is an opportunity to rethink what is a problematic issue in the wider public world. Excuse me. So Christian communities can and should play a seminal role in an ongoing agonistic dialogue with partners and adversaries in public life about the nature and application of a post-neoliberal common good. Agonistic in the sense that a recognition of fundamental differences in basic beliefs and positions. It's not a matter of tying these out and excluding them in a kind of liberal pluralism, but a peaceable capacity to dialogue in the pursuit of provisional common goals. A good example of this is I think, Luke Brereton's work. Luke Brereton is a political theologian, resurrecting democracy about citizenship and common life, and also more recently, I forget the name of the title. But nonetheless, that's an example of someone who worked, for example, in the example that Brereton talks about, is the work of London citizens back in the 2000s, where a coalition of groups lobby government to actually provide a living wage for people living in the London district. What does this mean in terms of our engagement in the particular task of deliberating the common good and providing a Christian perspective on the common good? I think there are three key areas. One is the defence of civil society. The second is to defend and to recover the role of the enabling state. Here I have in mind the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about the entrepreneurial state, pushing against the neoliberal view that the state is a part of the problem, you need to leave it to the market. She's saying the state has always played a central role. This is a problematic challenge because the state can be seen as overbearing, but nonetheless the solution is not to have less state, but better state, better government. But also the defence and reform of the institutions of public discourse. Much of our capacity in public life to talk about the common good has been so diminished by the way in which the media public discourse, not only in terms of its technological developments, but also the media has been seen as an industry. And so we've seen the rise of media agencies such as the Murdoch News and so on, and also the diminishing of the role of national broadcasters. That reflects a kind of distortion of public discourse, which we need to battle against in order to maintain the common good. How's my time going?
You're up.
Just in passing, I do want to mention one brief example. Last week I read Graham Turner's book, Broken, Universities, Politics and the Public Good, as a good example of where we can intervene in the questions of the common good in our public life. Turner is a emeritus professor of cultural studies at the University of Queensland, but has described not only the kind of the current problems of universities in terms of funding, international students, mismatch between professor salaries and so on, but also has highlighted the way in which since the Dawkins Revolution in the 70s, there's been a shift in the basic purpose of universities from providing civic and moral shaping of students to one of facilitating market processes. So it's exemplified the kind of move that neoliberalism has produced. What's interesting in this book, although Graham Turner gestures towards some recovery, possible recovery, it seems to me that needs to be pushed further in terms of a return to some kind of, well, what are the transcendental conditions of the university inquiry and discourse? I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much.